There is a photograph that should not exist. It shows an old man standing on a beach in the middle of the most violent morning of the 20th century. And he is not crouching, not running, not taking cover. He is standing upright in the open, leaning on a wooden cane, looking around at the chaos as calmly as a man inspecting a garden. Bullets are in the air, shells are falling. Young soldiers half his age are pressed flat against the sand. And the old man with the cane is on his feet because he has decided that this is exactly where he is meant to be. His name was Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. He was 56 years old. He was the son of a president of the United States. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, he became the oldest man and the only general to land in the first wave on D-Day. He did it with a pistol on his hip and a cane in his hand, and the most remarkable part of the story is that the Army had told him more than once that he could not go at all. To understand why a 56-year-old general was wading ashore under fire, you have to understand the man. He was the eldest son of President Theodore Roosevelt, the same Roosevelt who had charged up a hill in Cuba and won, decades later, his own Medal of Honor. Ted Jr. grew up under the enormous shadow of that name, and he spent his life trying to prove he was worthy of it. He had fought in the First World War with real distinction, leading men in France, and he had paid for it. He was shot in the knee. He was caught in a poison gas attack that damaged his lungs. By the time the Second World War came, those old wounds, along with arthritis and a failing heart, had caught up with him. He walked with a cane. He was, by any reasonable measure, an old and physically broken man, and he wanted, more than anything, to land with the first wave at Normandy. He was already a brigadier general, serving as the assistant commander of the 4th Infantry Division, the unit assigned to take the beach the Allies had codenamed Utah. He could have done his job from a command post, safely behind the assault, directing the battle from a map. That is what generals do. That is what generals are for. But Roosevelt did not want to direct the landing from behind. He wanted to be on the sand with the very first men ashore. So he asked. And he was told no. He asked again, and again the answer was no. The reasons were obvious. He was 56, he was in poor health, and you do not send a general, especially a sick one, into the deadliest minutes of an amphibious assault. But Roosevelt would not let it go. He sat down and put his request in writing, a formal letter to his commanding officer. In it he made an argument that had nothing to do with his own glory. He wrote that he personally knew the officers and the men of those lead units. He believed that if they saw him there, on the beach in the first wave, it would steady their nerves. A general sharing their danger would tell every frightened young soldier that this could be survived. Faced with that letter, his commander finally relented, and so the decision was made. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. would go in with the first wave at Utah Beach, the only general in the entire invasion to do so. The morning of June 6th did not go to plan, not for Roosevelt and not for the men of the 4th Division. As the landing craft churned through the smoke and the strong coastal current, something went wrong with the navigation. The first wave drifted off course, and instead of landing where the plans had marked, the boats came ashore more than a mile to the south on an unfamiliar stretch of beach. For a moment it was a disaster waiting to happen. The maps, the rehearsals, the carefully assigned objectives, all of it had been built around landing in a specific place, and that place was now a mile away. Officers coming off the boats stared at the unfamiliar dunes and felt the ground drop out from under their plans. This was the moment Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. had talked his way onto that beach for. He was one of the first men off the boats. While younger officers froze, trying to reconcile the terrain in front of them with the maps in their heads, the old general limped forward on his cane, looked at where they actually were, and made a decision on the spot. The reinforcements coming in behind them, he reasoned, would simply have to follow them to wherever they were now. There was no time to fix the mistake. There was only time to fight from where they stood. And so, the story goes, he turned to the officers around him and spoke the words that would follow him into history. The war, he told them, would start from right here. It is a simple line. But think about what it did. In a single sentence, the general took a landing that had gone wrong and turned it into a landing that was simply happening somewhere new. The fear of being lost, of being out of position, was swept aside. He was telling them, with total calm, that the mistake did not matter, that the only thing that mattered was the work directly in front of them. And then he began to do that work himself. For the rest of that morning, Roosevelt did something almost no general in history has done. He moved up and down the beach on foot, leaning on his cane, walking through the same fire that had everyone else pinned down, and he organized the fight wave by wave. As each new group of soldiers came ashore, confused, soaked, terrified, dropped into the wrong place, there was the old man to greet them, point them toward their new objectives, and send them inland. Survivors remembered his calm. They remembered his humor. They remembered that he seemed almost unbothered by the storm of metal in the air and that his steadiness was contagious. A general who is afraid makes frightened men more afraid. A general who strolls the beach with a cane and a joke makes frightened men believe they can do this. That was exactly the effect he had set out to create, in writing, weeks before. And on the day, it worked. When the commanding general of the 4th Division finally came ashore later and began to plan his orders, Roosevelt was already there to meet him with a complete and accurate picture of the situation. He had landed with the first wave, gotten the troops moving across the beach, and grasped the whole confused scene before his superior had even arrived. The landing at Utah, which had begun with a navigational error that could have unraveled everything, instead became the most successful of all 5 beaches that day. And a large part of the reason was the unhurried, cane-leaning leadership of an old man who had been told to stay home. There is a detail in this story that makes it almost unbearable to read. Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. was not the only member of his family on the beaches of Normandy that morning. His own son, Captain Quentin Roosevelt II, landed that same day at the beach, codenamed Omaha, the bloodiest beach of them all. Father and son, both ashore on D-Day, on different beaches in the same invasion. They were the only father and son known to have taken part in the Normandy landings together. The general had spent his whole life under the weight of his own famous father, and now he and his son carried that name onto the same battlefield on the same day, hours apart. And the family connection runs deeper still. When Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. was finally awarded the Medal of Honor for what he did at Utah Beach, it placed him in the rarest company imaginable. His father, President Theodore Roosevelt, had also received the Medal of Honor. That made them only the second father and son in American history to both earn the nation's highest award for valor. A president and his son, each holding the Medal of Honor, each for charging toward the guns. But Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. never knew that the medal was coming, because the heart that had been weakened by decades of hard living and harder service did not last much longer than the beach itself. A little over a month after D-Day, on July 12, 1944, while the campaign in Normandy ground on, the general's body finally gave out. He suffered a sudden heart attack in France and died. He was still 56 years old. The man who had survived the deadliest morning of the war while standing upright in the open, who had walked through machine gun fire on a cane and lived, was taken not by a German bullet, but by his own exhausted heart only 5 weeks later. General George Patton, who was not a man given to soft sentiment, called him one of the bravest men he had ever known. The Medal of Honor was awarded after his death, in the autumn of that year, for his leadership on Utah Beach. The citation honored exactly what the witnesses had described, a general who repeatedly braved enemy fire, who steadied his men by his sheer presence, who turned a landing gone wrong into a foothold won. He was buried in the American cemetery in Normandy, overlooking the coast he had helped to take. And in time, his younger brother Quentin, who had died as a pilot in the First World War decades earlier, was reinterred beside him, so that the two Roosevelt brothers, who had given themselves to two different wars, could lie together at last above the sea. So what do we take from the story of the general with the cane? It would be easy to make him into a simple symbol of courage, and he was certainly brave. But the deeper thing about Theodore Roosevelt Jr. is that his bravery was a choice he had to fight for. The Army did not order him onto that beach. They tried to keep him off it. He had every reason a man could want to stay safe: his age, his rank, his health, his name, his family. He chose the opposite. He chose to put himself in the worst place on the worst morning, not for glory, but because he had calculated, coldly and correctly, that an old general standing upright in the fire would save younger lives by giving frightened men something to believe in. He was right, and it cost him everything. The next time you see that photograph, the old man on the beach, leaning on his cane while the world comes apart around him, remember that he was not supposed to be there. Remember that he asked 3 times. Remember that he stood up in that fire on purpose, so that the men around him would not have to be afraid alone. That is what leadership looked like on the morning of June 6, 1944. Not a voice on a radio, miles from danger. An old man, a pistol and a cane, telling 1,000 terrified soldiers that the war would start from right here, and then walking into it himself to prove that it could be done.